Welcome to the National Assembly for Wales and to the Pierhead tonight, and thank you very much for coming.
It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to the Pierhead tonight for the Royal Television Society annual lecture. We are pleased this year that the lecture will be given by Guto Harri, who is the Director of Communications for News UK. Now, Guto is, of course, instantly recognisable to us all from his days as Chief Political Correspondent at the BBC. So we all know his secrets, which is very helpful when it comes to questions. So who better than to give us an insight into how the UK media views Wales, and in particular the reporting of Welsh political and civic life. But before we hear Guto, I would like to just cast your minds back to the RTS lecture last year. Now, I stood on this very platform and outlined my concerns about what I call the democratic deficit. And I believe it is one of the most profound problems facing devolution in Wales. We have to ask who is relaying, or perhaps more importantly, who will be relaying the work of the National Assembly to the people of Wales in the future. And of course, performing that crucial role of holding the decision makers here in Cardiff to account. We have a UK media, both broadcasters and print, which fails to report the huge differences in approach to public policy in devolved fields such as health and education. It means there's a substantial Welsh audience often gets information that doesn't apply to them at all. Now, research by Professor Anthony King on Cardiff University School of Journalism highlighted the fact that some of our leading UK broadcasters often default to an Anglo-centric position, a position which promotes policy issues affecting only England as though they apply to the whole of the UK. Now, Professor King's original report was published in 2008, and at the RTS lecture last year, he noted that despite efforts by some broadcasters, the problem still exists. The situation is compounded by the financial pressures on our Indigenous Welsh national and regional press, which leaves many unable to resource comprehensive coverage of Assembly news. Last year, I committed to holding a series of sessions in this building in an attempt to start a discussion about the issue and to possibly find solutions. In May, we had a fascinating discussion with a panel of leading UK journalists, including Kevin Maguire, Peter Riddle and Peter Knowles, and that was chaired by the former head of Global News at the BBC, Richard Sambrook. Now, I don't accept the headline assertion of the UK media that all our debates here are boring, any more than all those in Westminster are actually interesting. Our debate on organ donations was wise, profound and important, as anything you'll hear in any parliament this year. And I believe, and of course, it will have a major impact on people's lives in Wales and across the UK. Now, the Assembly will, of course, continue to challenge UK media outlets to properly report the work we do at the Senedd to their Welsh audiences, and indeed those beyond Wales. But it was the other sessions we held with Wales's local regional press and digital media platforms that perhaps offered more hope and scope for action. Over the summer months, we've been taking some of those interesting ideas and formulating a response, including what I think are some innovative proposals. Much of it focuses on what support can be provided to the emerging digital platforms in the covering of the Welsh Assembly. So we plan to work with digital and hyper-local media and partner organisations to create a journalism hub in the Senedd that could provide content to these new digital channels. We'll be making it easier to report by providing better communication facilities on the Senedd estate, making the Assembly's data more open and accessible, ensuring that Assembly members are fully informed about how best to use the communication tools which are now available in this digital age. I think that's particularly referring to me, by the way, so I'm not really there yet. We intend to work more closely with media organisations to take the Assembly out to the communities they represent with a series of regional press days, and also working with those organisations to provide induction sessions for trainee journalists to ensure a better understanding of the work of our institution. Now, for us to move forward on these proposals, the Assembly will need the support of media organisations, both old and new, as well as journalists and other partners. So over the coming weeks, we plan to discuss in fuller detail with these partners and develop some of these ideas. And one of the main comments from our peerhead sessions was that all of us are talking about the issue, but nothing seems to be done to address it. So the National Assembly must and will play its part. So I look forward to working closely with many of you here tonight to turn our discussions about the democratic deficit into action. So thank you very much. And before we hear Guto, it's my great pleasure to introduce Tim Hartley, who is Chair of the Wales RTS Centre. Tim.
Diolch yn fawr, Llywydd. I'll be speaking a little bit in Welsh to start with if you want to put the headphones on just for a moment.
On behalf of the RTS, may I welcome you here to the Pierhead building and thank the presiding officer and the National Assembly for Wales for their welcome. It is very important that we collaborate in this way with partners, as the RTS is an educational charity, and by now we do have a partnership given the events that are happening, as the presiding officer mentioned, and this is the follow-up to the speech given last year by Professor Tony King at our annual lecture, because the debate does stretch across the range of options that there are for the media in Wales and what that actually means for real democracy here in Wales. Some people believe that the most important thing is to protect budgets for news and current affairs output, while others say that that just doesn't go far enough, and we have to reflect ourselves as Welsh people to our own people across all genres of television and radio output. Another group of people will say, of course, that unless we devolve broadcasting as a whole, then we will not achieve what we aim to achieve. Tonight's debate then is very timely because, of course, of what is happening in Scotland and the vote on independence taking place there, and also the announcement made by the UK government last week that powers over taxation are to be devolved in Wales. So all of these things are coming together, and I think it's important, therefore, that we actually consider what the response of the mass media, the papers and the television should be to them.
To our guest speaker now, Guto Harri is a Cardiff boy, I'm glad to say. He was educated at Ysgol Gyfun Llanharri, studied politics, philosophy and economics in Oxford, before coming back to Cardiff and doing the postgraduate journalism course at the university. He had a long career at the BBC. He did stints in Rome and North America before becoming the chief political correspondent. He had a short time then in public affairs before in 2008 joining Boris Johnson as the Director of Communications during Boris's first term as Mayor of London. Last year he became Director of Communications for News UK, formerly News International, a Rupert Murdoch company, which owns The Sun, The Times and The Sunday Times. And perhaps it is timely that we're having this lecture this week when it's the opening week in the case against Rebecca Brooks and Coulson, and of course that there is still continued discussion about the regulation of the press. And I think Guto is going to touch on these issues in his speech tonight. I first got to know Guto back when we were both working for the BBC. In 1991, that shows how old we were. We were during the first Gulf War in 1991. Guto was posted to Amman in Jordan, and I was in Washington, D.C. And as the war went on, Radio Cymru's post-prynawn programme used to pit us against each other at the end of every afternoon. And there was Guto standing up for the dispossessed Kurds in northern Iraq and the downtrodden Palestinians and fighting their cause. And I was cast as the cheerleader for George Bush Sr., he being the megalomaniacal millionaire intent on world domination. How things have changed. Now, just to look at the title of our lecture tonight, this comes from a conversation Guto and I had some 10 years ago. In a previous incarnation, I was desperate to get Rhodri Morgan and his cabinet on the UK media, and it just wasn't working. So I had a chat with Guto, and he said at that time, Wales, you're not on their radar. So I suggested this as a title, and Guto very craftily said, I'm not going to answer the question before we've actually asked it. So the question is, Wales not on their radar? It'll be interesting to see whether or not things have changed from 10 years ago when Guto had his own unique take on it. So with that, gallwn ni droed croeso teim galon I Guto Harri a diolch yn fawr
We
iawn.
warmly welcome Guto Harri and thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. And what I remember from being questioned by Tim on Radio Cymru is that Tim said in one interview that he'd done the majority of his contributions naked in bed because it was that particular time of day. And one of the few things what I didn't know what to say in response to that. And good evening, and thanks very much for inviting me here. It's always a pleasure to come back to Cardiff. The last time I was here was for the BAFTA Awards, where even I was amazed, and I thought I knew about the talent and creativity here, but I was amazed at how good things are in the Welsh media world are at present, and it was a great pleasure. And my only regret from being here tonight is that I'm going to miss the latest episode of Y Gwyll. I watched it last week, and it's taken hold straight away, and it's been a great start to an innovative and very important series.
But we're here tonight to discuss the democratic deficit, not the only one in Welsh politics, but a very important one. One the presiding officer cares passionately about, and one that she has been quite right to focus upon. So let me start by agreeing with the core premise. A healthy democracy needs a robust and responsible press, independent, professional, well-resourced and free from political interference. That's why I'm proud to be playing my small part in a big battle at the moment, currently underway, to preserve that freedom and see off the lobbyists and politicians that are trying to override centuries of very important tradition. A free press and a mature democracy cannot and should not be at the mercy of the politicians that it seeks to hold to account. And nor does it need to be. I can look you all in the eye tonight, and as somebody who's quite heavily involved in all these discussions, and say that I am extremely confident that there will be a robust new regulator in place by the spring, paid for by the industry, but delivering virtually everything that Lord Justice Leveson demanded, able to levy fines of up to £1 million, able to order corrections, to demand apologies, to initiate investigations, and what's more, nearly the entire industry is signed up to this, left and right, tabloid and broadsheet, local, regional, and so-called national press. There is no need for a royal charter. The recognition body that will be established by that charter will be redundant. Another quango with no real role, a sad waste of precious taxpayers' funds. I would hope everyone in this room who wants a robust and responsible press would basically agree with that sentiment and encourage the speedy establishment of the body that will be known as IPSO, the Independent Press Standards Organisation. The threat of regulation, however, is not the main threat that I've been asked to address tonight. The democratic deficit that the presiding officer has highlighted is focused not on the freedom of the press, but on its outlook. And the argument basically is that too many people in Wales rely on the London media for their news. And the London media, though strong, independent and professional, hopefully, is either ignorant or not interested in Wales. That's the claim. It is a fact that a number of Welsh people watch network news and read so-called national newspapers. Hopefully not a bad thing. I speak for a company that produces the Sun, Times, and the Sunday Times, and I'm proud to say about 3 million people pay to read one of those papers every day. About 400,000 of them during the course of the week in Wales. About 300,000 people watch the 6 o'clock network news on the BBC, and others will watch Sky, ITV and others. I won't go into social media tonight, but often the numbers there dwarf the so-called traditional media. My old boss Boris now has more than 800,000 followers on Twitter, people that he can access without the filter of the press or indeed his spin doctor. Not always wise. My current boss Rupert Murdoch has 500,000 followers, and he talks to them pretty openly in very plain Antipodean English. Digital platforms offer cheap and effective opportunities in Wales that could overcome some of the difficult distribution issues that we've had in Wales historically. And I think that any platform that can reach Welsh speakers across the globe effortlessly and virtually for free has got to have huge potential, though I won't dwell on this any further tonight. Nor will I talk about the Welsh press and media, y cyfryngau Cymraeg a Chymreig. They matter, and I'm pleased to have witnessed a period of considerable investment in news and current affairs, and particularly in political journalism during my professional lifetime, where I was once part of a tiny team for BBC Wales, and it's great to see Catherine Allen here tonight, tiny team led by Catherine Allen over there in Westminster. There is now a pretty hefty department with a lot of emerging talent and plenty of outlets, including a lot of live and coverage of the Senedd. No, I've been asked to address a particular claim that has considerable and possibly growing resonance, the suggestion that the London media is ignorant, dismissive, hostile, or patronising. Clearly, it hasn't always been well-informed or perhaps well-intentioned, or as well-intentioned as it should be, and attitudes towards Wales across Offa's Dyke are often less than ideal. I have my own horror stories. Please take your silly name and even more stupid accent back to Wales where you belong, was one charming response from a listener who heard my first broadcast on the World at One about 25 years ago. I remember the rest of it too. Living in England, I'm well aware of the hatred that the Welsh race has towards the English nation. Why should we, the English, put up with ghastly Welsh plebs, that's me, preaching to us on Radio 4? And there was another complaint to my editor that essentially went along the lines of, I do not know his name, but he's very Welsh, with a one-dimensional voice and the brain of a retarded amoeba. Not only a clever amoeba, not even a clever amoeba, not even an amoeba with special needs or learning difficulties, a retarded amoeba. And I remember being sent to Wales for the first time on a story for the network, and the producer on the Flagship Today programme saying, get me lots of poor people with strong accents. I was shocked. Hopefully you're shocked. I think that's changed. The lead anchor on the Today programme is a boy from Splot called John Humphreys. Does a magnificent job. The main TV news at 10 o'clock news, as we all know, is presented most nights by Hugh Edwards, a boy from Llangennech. Well, try pronouncing Llangennech if you were brought up in Surrey. More important in my view are the men and women who've been reporters in Wales for the network. Tim Hartley, one of them. Trina Bjorwyth, Gail Foley, Sian Lloyd, a whole host of numbers, but perhaps in particular under Wira Davies, I think there was quite a distinct perceptive change from my point of view. Not only did they ensure that major milestones in Welsh history were covered on the network, but major stories now that could be done anywhere in the UK quite often are done in Wales. The recent storms, for instance, that hit large chunks of the UK, as far as I clicked, one of the main evening news on a Sunday, I think, with a huge audience, the main package was done from Aberystwyth by the excellent Hywel Griffiths. He was giving the story across the UK, but he was doing it from Wales. That, I think, is a real breakthrough. Not tokenistic coverage, not ticking a box called let's put Wales on the bulletin for the sake of it, but doing a main story from Wales using Welsh-based correspondence. There are other stories like that in the field of crime, welfare changes, social trends, business stories, not enough of them, but done in Wales rather than in the Midlands, West Country, or traditionally within the M25. I've also done trawl, protectively, defensively, of recent Welsh stories that have been done in The Sun and The Times, produced by the company that I work for. Wales offered tax-raising powers in The Times. Higher stamp duty to be applied on second homes, done in The Times for a reason. Cardiff Airport nationalised, done in The Times. Plaid's victory in Ynys Môn, done pretty much everywhere. And believe it or not, the Welsh Government offering business advice to lap dancers. I missed that one, but I looked it up. It's true. And no connection, but The Sun has done a bunch of stories too, including an employment roadshow, tied to the previous one, in Cardiff, where they took an opinion piece from Carwyn Jones. And I heard today that there's going to be a similar gig next year, so The Sun will come back to Cardiff with a roadshow like that and to help create jobs. And with 2 Welsh teams in the Premier League, Doctor Who in Cardiff Bay and one Cardiff Comprehensive that miraculously managed to produce both Gareth Bale and Sam Warburton in the same vintage. I'm pleased to say, and I have to tiptoe carefully here, but I did speak to him this morning, that the new editor of The Sun, who's a very decent guy and a Scot, is starting to think about investing in a stronger presence and possibly an office in Wales. The Sun already has an Irish edition, a Scottish edition, very well-staffed office in Manchester, covering the north of England, and often doing a separate edition for the north of England. And though it's early days yet, a Sun office in Cardiff or possibly Swansea is not out of the question. I think that would be great for journalism in Wales. I obviously think there is room for improvement. It would be good to see more coverage of Wales and better coverage of Wales in press and broadcast. But cards on the table now. Do I think Wales gets a particularly rough deal from the responsible press in London? I'm afraid the answer for me is not really. You can only really argue that point if you can show that there are great stories in Wales which could resonate much further afield that are being ignored. So let's imagine being the editor of the 10 o'clock news, looking at his or her running order tonight, wondering what to put in the programme. Every day there'll be at least one big political story, maybe 2 or 3. Then there's business, industry, the markets, both here and abroad. I spent 2 years in New York pitching a story literally every day from there. Then you've got big bureaus in Washington, Brussels, Johannesburg, and Jerusalem, all pitching stories that have resonance across entire continents. Then there's science, technology, nature, culture, and the quirky. Only 8 or 9 of those stories will make it onto the bulletin. That's where the bar is set. And how often, really, sincerely, is it a Welsh story that can cross that bar? When there is, as a whole, my contention is they get done. The presiding officer suggests in Welsh Agenda that policy differences at the Assembly would be interesting to English audiences. Maybe, but to be honest, not very often. Not very often even for Welsh audiences. News has got to be novel. Journalism is about telling great tales that help people make sense of the world and ideally take better decisions because they're better informed. Particular stories are great if they tell a broader, universal truth. Big themes come alive if they can be put in the compelling context of a particular person or place. The fact that Wales does some political things differently is not that interesting in itself. Doing things differently is only interesting if there are lessons that can be drawn for people outside the immediate patch. If I asked you tonight how many people here would be interested in the proceedings of Milton Keynes Council, I can confidently predict there wouldn't be many. And I'm not comparing Milton Keynes with Wales, nor the Senedd with the Council. But if I asked you whether you thought it was a good idea to allow people to vote in a referendum on whether they wanted their taxes to go up or their services to be cut, you might find that interesting. And yes, Milton Keynes held such a referendum many years ago, and I, as a young reporter on the World at One, was sent there to cover it. It was interesting. It did have wider resonance. And that was not because they needed to tick a box called Milton Keynes, nor actually point out the differences between a council outside the M25 or within it. It wasn't a story about Milton Keynes. It was a story about people and what they're prepared to pay for politics and what they want in return, which is universal and timeless, as all good news stories should be. There have been stories here at the Assembly. What the Senedd decided on organ donation was genuinely interesting. An example of Wales leading the way, trailblazing on an issue that will save lives. It begged the question virtually everywhere else, why aren't you doing this too? I was proud, and guess what? It got coverage. It got coverage on TV, it got coverage in the most prestigious and in the biggest outlets, including The Sun. Going back a bit to a story I covered myself as a political journalist, I remember coming down here to cover the toppling of Alan Michael as First Minister. A real story, again, of universal resonance, well beyond the patch. Think of it in Shakespearean terms, Rhodri and Alun, 2 men, one destined to lead his clan, but condemned by outside interference to serve under another chief who never wanted the job in the first place. 2 lives ruined until a dramatic coup puts them both out of the misery and everybody lives happily ever after. That's why that story worked. Not because it was a tick box about Cardiff or devolution. Let's do the token devolution story with boring graphics saying what the powers of the Assembly are. I'm not saying that Carwyn Jones has to be toppled for the Senedd to get noticed, though it probably would guarantee it. But in 4 years working with Boris Johnson at City Hall in London, I found it pretty easy to get coverage of his political agenda, as well as the huge personality of the mayor himself. And I can't help wondering, to be honest with you, why there isn't more interest in the First Minister in Wales, in Carwyn Jones. Carwyn Jones is the most senior Labour figure, not only in Wales, but in office across the UK today. What he and his team do here could easily be seen as a template for what Britain would be like under a Labour government, a distinct possibility in 18 months' time. He could also offer an alternative outlook on his own party leader, as I dare say Boris Johnson occasionally did. Trust me, either of those things would be interesting, but how many people in this room, about as well-informed and engaged as they come, feel they could explain what the big story is here? Could you really articulate how number 10 would be different if the inhabitant was more like Carwyn Jones than David Cameron? I don't feel, as someone who spent more than a decade as a fairly senior political correspondent and as a Welsh-speaking Welshman from Cardiff, that I could spell out in simple sentences what the current Welsh agenda is. What is the big story? So is the London media missing something, or is the administration and the wider political class in Cardiff failing to articulate something? Politicians don't just get coverage. It's not part of the package when you're elected. It has to be earned and generated. Apart from doing something distinct and tangible, it needs to be timely, relevant, in tune with wider agendas and public preoccupations. And guess what? Journalists need TLC. They need help making sense of a fast-moving, complex world which they now have to report and interpret in an instant. Do the big players in Wales do enough to cultivate those contacts, engage with influential journalists, provide them with compelling tales that will put them in the paper or on the bulletin, stories that get over that mark? That's one of the 8 things that are covered on the 10 o'clock news. In other words, are we still too passive in our politics in Wales, sitting in Cardiff, complaining about coalition cuts, and then moaning that the London media doesn't care? I hope I'm wrong. There are, of course, some specific policy issues where Wales is making its mark: tuition fees, prescription charges, nationalising an airport. And there are interesting questions to be asked on all of those. Difficult questions about political priorities, good use of precious public funds, whether political creed or sentiment is clashing with sound public policy. If the London media hasn't caught up with the fact that Wales is dishing out free paracetamol to the masses, but denying some cancer sufferers drugs that they could get in England, be grateful, perhaps. When The Sun did a whole page a few months ago on unemployment in the valleys, they found a family where 4 generations had never worked. Not a great picture for Wales, not a great advert for a one-party sort of rule by Labour over decades in the valleys. I'm almost tempted to say, careful what you wish for. But that isn't my view, of course. I believe in a free press as a core component of an effective democratic system. And here in Wales, not uniquely, but as in far too many countries, that free press is increasingly struggling to survive. Most papers have seen circulation decline and advertising collapse. Most respond with cuts. I'm pleased that my company is very clear that cuts are not the answer. And because we charge for our papers online as well as in print, we can invest in them. Our stated mission is to secure a sustainable future for news. And next year we'll be moving to a new building where we've taken out a 30-year lease. So we intend to stick around for the long term. It's a long-term commitment. Lasting that long means finding new people to read our title on different platforms, and new people to write them and produce them, of course. And one of the sad effects of the decline in local and regional papers is that the food chain that feeds talent to the big papers has been depleted considerably. So I'm particularly pleased tonight to be able to share with you details of an ambitious new scheme that we'll be formally announcing tomorrow to invest in the future of journalism by investing in the next generation of journalists. We're calling it the News Academy, using established journalists from The Sun, The Times and The Sunday Times to get today's teenagers to appreciate news and consider a career in it. We will send them to speak to thousands of young people in hundreds of schools across the UK, including in Wales. I'll go back to Ysgol Gyfun Llanharri if they'll take me. There'll be competitions and a website where the best photos, features and news can be published. That website will offer online training tools, free of charge, providing the basic skills to operate effectively, how to spot a story, how to write for news, how to stay within the law, adhere to a code of ethics, build contacts and so forth. And we will be holding a series of one-day conferences in Glasgow, Manchester, Dublin, and yes, I'm pleased to say, here in Cardiff. A chance, hopefully next March, for up to 200 Welsh students between 15 and 18 to spend a day with senior figures across the industry, getting tips and exploring whether they may want to pursue one of the most interesting and worthwhile careers I can think of. Wales needs good journalists. Welsh democracy, hopefully still evolving, needs a strong press. Yes, we could and should seek better coverage from London, but what we need above all is to sort out our story here in Wales. If we don't know it, how can we ever expect others to tell it? Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Diolch yn fawr iawn, Guto. Guto's willing to take questions in Welsh or in English. Please feel free. One at a time, though. We're not going to take them in batches this time.
If there are no questions, it's fine.
I'll do it in English. So you've provocatively said that we don't know what the base story is. But you have been thinking about this. You come from a particular background. You must have some ideas yourself about what the base story is, or how that should be presented, or how we should arrive at that. Is it an issue between the political parties, or is it something which is an umbrella across all those parties?
I had written in a section that posed a long list of questions. Where do the jobs come from? Why are we the second worst part of the UK for attracting inward investment now when we were close to the top? Do we want the Commonwealth Games in 2026 or not? What are our prospects of getting it? How do we aim that way? How will we react to Scotland becoming independent, or react to Scotland voting against independence? There are a whole string of questions to which I'm not sure there are answers to. Why do we think that it's good to sort of hand out paracetamol rather than, and deny people cancer drugs? Are we comfortable with the idea that waiting lists go up, but prescriptions are free? Are we comfortable with educational standards having fallen behind since devolution? All these things were meant to get better. And not only do I not know, as somebody who's reasonably well informed, what the answers are to those individual questions, but I don't know how they hang together. I know what the agenda is. And I do think that credit to Ron Davies in his day, that he created a sense of mission for Wales and a sense of purpose. And there are people in this room who are involved in that. But there's a real sense that Wales needed devolution because Wales could do things differently and could do things more constructively and maybe in a more sort of humane way or in a more sort of progressive, liberal kind of way. But at the moment, I don't know where the jobs come from. I would pose a question myself. When there are 200 hedge funds in Paris, each worth an absolute fortune. One hedge fund in particular has 2 to 3 billion quid to chuck about, not to mention what the partners earn and where they spend it. Those hedge funds are being clobbered at the moment by the high taxes imposed by a socialist prime minister. If what I would like to see would be a politician in Cardiff jump on the Eurostar and go to Paris and say, if your government doesn't want the jobs and wealth and the tax revenue and all the spillover that you create, we would. But when I pose this, and I've played a parlour game with a lot of Welsh politicians on this, when I've suggested that, they've all come back with you, well, you can't possibly sort of expect us to advocate bringing hedge funds into Cardiff. It's like bankers. Everybody hates them. And, that's the sterile nature of a politics that is still too sentimental and emotionally tied to a few sort of great sort of myths about a sort of Labour tradition and not sort of open enough to the hard-headed facts of where do the jobs come from and where do you generate the taxes from in order to be able to spend them on things that we're so good at spending upon in Wales. And David Melding here has sort of established a wonderful think tank to try and pose some of those questions, but it's not there. And until it's there, why would it get covered? And if, David Miliband has proved in a few weeks how he can dominate the agenda very effectively by identifying a big theme, the cost of living crisis, by homing in on the cost of fuel bills this winter. There's been nothing in the limited powers of the Welsh Assembly to stop a political agenda in Wales, if you wanted a left-wing political agenda, from having gone big on that. First Minister has the power to haul in those who sort of run the water companies, the energy companies, anyone who virtually issues a bill that Welsh households are forced to pay, nothing to stop them hauling them in and saying this isn't good enough. And there's been years in which Wales could have done that. We had 2 years working in City Hall to show how a Conservative administration might do things slightly different to a government run by Gordon Brown. And I think in 2 years we showed a very different agenda, and it'd be good if Wales was to show a different agenda now. If that answers the question.
I don't think there is an immediate answer to it, obviously. It's a debate that we all need to have so that we know which direction we're travelling in.
Yeah.
and therefore then things will become clear as to whether it is the funds in Paris or whether it is a left-wing agenda. We don't know where we stand at the moment, but we are all searching for that inspiration, I think.
Perhaps what another way of putting it is, I just remember being a sort of young reporter on the World at One and being terrified in the editorial meetings. They were particularly ruthless intellectually, and there was an editor who after 10 seconds his eyes would start to glaze over. After 20, if you're not making your point, he'd start sort of coughing. After 25, he'd say, "I'm bored." And if you carried on after 30 without him sort of being turned around, you wouldn't speak for weeks afterwards and probably wouldn't have a great future on the programme. So it's a good test of why should Wales be on the World at One today in 20 seconds. You know, it's a particularly harsh way of putting it, but try doing it in 2 minutes. It's quite hard on most days. Organ donation, a great example. More of that, you're there. We're there. Who's next?
Very interested in the possibility of more jobs and some possibly coming to open up a office in Cardiff or Swansea. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, I have to be careful, but a year ago when I had only very recently joined the company, there was a chief executive who was particularly interested. He was a Kiwi, and he was quite shocked when he flew in, parachuted in to save a company in deep trouble. But he was quite horrified by the London-centric nature of the UK, not just in journalism, but across the board. And he was a man who sort of invested very heavily in a new office in Manchester. And I think the way that was heading was towards a Northern England edition, as there is one in Scotland, there is one in Ireland, and he'd started talking about one in Wales. At the time, the editor of The Sun was not interested. There's a new editor of The Sun now who's a Scot. He is interested. I spoke to him today, explaining that I was coming here, and we've talked about this a lot, and said, can I just hint at this? And he said, well, you know, I haven't cleared the budget, haven't really worked it out or anything like that. So I introduced that caveat. But if you're asking me whether I think we should invest in covering South Wales, but in particularly in the south, because frankly for The Sun, again, is a point, it's not the politics that will draw people here. It'll be the football, it'll be Catherine Zeta-Jones being back on Single Street, it'll be, you know, if she is, changes from day to day. It'll be, you know, social things, it'll be the quirky stories, it'll be shocking crime things, it'll be examples of welfare excess, you know, careful what you wish for. But I think there is definitely an interest, a strong interest in doing this. And I think the fact that we will be looking to sort of recruit 200 teenagers in Wales to the News Academy, which we can establish in the new year, would be a sign of that commitment extended to Wales very clearly.
Oh my God. I'm a journalism student in Cardiff University. I'm doing postgraduate, as you might did a couple years ago.
Yes, long time ago.
Is there any suggestions? How can we, we are international students, we are actually very passionate about maybe give contribution to Welsh society and maybe have some impact, maybe even in China. Is there any suggestion? And maybe for our postgraduate study, is there any suggestion? Maybe practical experience, maybe just something we could learn from. Thank you.
Experience in the company or on the titles or something I advocate you take back to China. Sorry, I didn't understand.
Maybe here, while we're here.
Yeah.
Maybe what something we can take back.
Well, one of the things that we kick around at the moment in the debate about regulation of the press is the UK has traditionally been a real beacon for the rest of the world of what a free press looks like in a mature, sophisticated, quite delicately balanced democracy, which is why, though it looks slightly over the top for some people, which is why the idea that politicians are in the mix at any point, however convoluted, in potentially licensing what can be said in newspapers is something that we go to the wall on as a free press in the UK. And one of the things that's been interesting for me is letters that we've had, particularly from countries in the Commonwealth, saying, please don't go down this step. If Britain has state regulation of the press, then just imagine what it would be like for me in China or Zimbabwe or, Ukraine. So there is a genuine concern. That's relevant. What I would urge you with China, what can I say? My experience of China was to go there with the great Boris Johnson at a fascinating time of juxtaposition where China was staging the Olympics and the closing ceremony, which was, if ever there was a display of state superiority, it was in your face. And it coincided, by coincidence, with the collapse of Lehman Brothers. And our Chinese hosts could not sort of enjoy more the contrast between a great symbol of Western capitalism going down the pan as Chinese communism was actually sending fireworks into the sky and sort of putting on a magnificent display. But, I left China sort of with a lot of respect for how doing things slowly but surely and humbly and determinately should never be underestimated, as we're all learning. I don't know if that's helpful or not.
I was just wondering, obviously you've talked about the fact that there has to be stories that are interesting enough to kind of make it into a news bulletin that has only 8 or 9 items. And thinking about the group of newspapers that you currently are working for, that obviously they have commercial interests. So they have, if something's not interesting, they don't have an obligation necessarily to cover it. I was wondering how that works in terms of something like the BBC, which is funded by everybody in the UK equally, and whether you think there's a difference between the obligations that more commercial broadcasters or newspapers have in comparison to something like the BBC, which has that kind of public service obligation, and maybe there's a distinction between the two of those.
I think the BBC has a duty, which it takes very seriously, to cover important things, whether they're interesting or not. Ideally, and I think it's true, the BBC goes out of its way to make things more interesting than perhaps the people involved in them have, to bring alive things that, general public have failed to bring alive. Referenda on, alternative voting systems, for instance, the next European elections. The BBC will rightly cover them. Actually, that's a bad example because that will be fascinating. And the BBC is right to do that. But even the BBC approaches it thinking, we don't want to do something that's a massive turn-off for the audience. Because the audience don't have to pay for it. Well, they've paid for it up front through a forced tax. But they do have to watch it, ideally. And I think the pressure is slightly more in your face on a daily basis when you're producing a newspaper that people actually have to pay to read. So if you get a bit too worthy then, you'll see your sales go down. But I don't think that's the fundamental clash in the end, because good news is interesting. My example of Milton Keynes, you can tell me, if I was to say top line is a council story in Milton Keynes, what a turn-off. But there are interesting stories everywhere. And one of the best pieces of journalism I've ever seen was a story that Matt Fry did on education in Japan. Why should we care? But it was such a superb piece of journalism that went to the core of the human spirit and what matters to all of us and what our hopes are, whether we're in Japan or whether we're in Upper Cwmtwrch or lower. That, it had resonance. And I think that's the test in the end. Virtually everything should be interesting, or if it's not, why is it being done? My father. How dare he?
You talked about priorities on World War I, for instance.
I'm happy to speak in Welsh, by the way. I just didn't know this.
Well, it's all right.
Yeah.
What I want to know is, how can you do priorities if you're not aware of certain things? If they're not there, they can't be prioritized. Sorry, if you get my meaning. Sometimes I read, about a glut of bilingual schools in Britain now, and we have a glut of bilingual schools in Wales. They're not aware of them. Otherwise, they would surely, discuss them. Anyway.
When I was on the World War I, one of the producers I worked with most was an excellent woman called Jo Cayford, Dr. Joanne Cayford, who grew up in Port Talbot, had a PhD from Aberystwyth, which was about the Welsh press, and she read about Wales every day and talked to her family back in Port Talbot. She knew exactly what was going on. She also read just about every magazine and newspaper she could get hold of before 7:30 in the morning. And she was doing that test herself. So it's not that people are ignorant. There are reporters on The Sun. There's a deputy news editor on The Times now. The number 2 on The Times now has roots in Wales and spends a lot of time here. So it's not ignorance in the end. These are hard-headed people who make judgments every day of the relative resonance of different stories and issues and debates and developments around the globe. And even though there's much more space in an edition of The Times than there is on the 10 o'clock news, even that is contested. And these days you can see what people read. And if you consistently see on your online version that nobody's reading stories of a certain ilk, it gets harder and harder to pitch them.
Guto, you talked about Carwyn and his reluctance, I think, is what you were hinting at, to project himself.
It's not a personal point.
Anyway, he's not been successful in projecting himself on a UK level. So certainly one area he's tried to project himself has been on constitutional matters, and I know this is a big story, but perhaps not one that is always gripping for the public, but whether succeeds is a big issue. The UK is rather an odd state in accepting with equanimity the principle of secession. And Carwyn has said some very interesting things about the need for a more formal federal approach, a constitutional convention that includes the whole of the UK. And Peter Riddell, in the earlier function we had, and pretty much agrees with your view generally, I think, that we've just got to work harder on the stories and the stuff that is really interesting. Does get covered as long as we can present it in an attractive way. But he did say that he had some sympathy with Wales's rather muted voice on UK constitutional questions, and that perhaps some ideas coming from Wales find it difficult to get a platform in London and in Scotland to some extent as well, whereas ideas that are sometimes weaker just because they emanate from London get quite a lot of coverage. Do you agree with that?
If they go further faster because they emanate in London, it's probably because it's easier for somebody to make the pitch. Because journalists are not people who wake up in the morning thinking, oh, today I'm going to do a story about, the implications for federalism of a yes vote or a no vote in Scotland. Somebody has to put the idea in their head. That happens when you bump into them at a party, or you drag them to a lecture, or you write something that gets published and somebody reads it. So it is a case, I think, of trying harder. And maybe over the next year, we've seen over the last 3 days how Scotland can totally dominate the agenda on the defence budget in the UK. The whole debate about what kind of ships what's left of the UK Navy will have in years to come was dominated the last few days by whether it should be in Glasgow Govan or in Portsmouth. That is Scotland. That is Alex Salmond being able to dominate the British debate, not only getting the Brits to notice what's going on in Scotland, just by playing to that gallery very, very cleverly and determinedly. But the contrast, I must say, between Alex Salmond and his operation and various administrations in Wales couldn't be starker. We look at a time, I still remember when Plaid Cymru took Rhondda and Islwyn, and the SNP did a similar thing in Scotland. Then Scotland voted for devolution and Wales voted for devolution within a week of each other, or a fortnight, whatever it was. That's where we were not that long ago. And since then, Scotland has gone like this and Wales has chugged along. So there is, they haven't got a head start. They've got Jim Naughty, we've got John Humphreys. They haven't got Hugh Edwards. But it's not just that. It's about the power of your argument. It's about the strength of your vision. It's about the determination with which you want to go out there and make the case. So if Karen wants to be our voice on that, there'll be willing outlets for a voice that says, let me tell you why the UK would be stronger together, from the perspective more unexpected than you would think of somebody who's a soft Welsh nationalist. To his credit. Garfield.
Gyda, lle ofyn cwestiwn yn Gymraeg felly yeah. Bobl.
Gyda, if I may ask my question in Welsh, if people want to use their interpretation equipment. You were very enthusiastic about the training scheme that you mentioned for young people, but almost every college and university is present is now training students in one way or another, and I'm sure it's a shortage of jobs for journalists. That's the main problem, not a shortage of journalists as such. So why are you launching this scheme now?
We had a conference in London in the summer as a test situation, and what we found was that journalism was busily becoming a profession for people who either don't want to earn much and don't have to because they live in poorer cities, or that they're from such prosperous families that they don't need to pay their own way. There's a lot of those people in journalism, for example, and that young people from more ordinary backgrounds, not poor necessarily, but more ordinary, and are disregarding journalism as a profession because after they go through college and have huge debts, journalism doesn't pay them enough for them to pay their bills. That's how it started. On top of that, a man needs a lot of, or a woman needs a lot of confidence to be a journalist, particularly on TV. And one thing that state schools doesn't do as well as private schools is give people self-confidence. Therefore, one of the things we want to do is foster interest, foster confidence, show the way, not on the university level, but for somebody starting off at 16 years old, to give them an idea of what journalism is. And we want to show them that journalism is not just going on the internet and putting a video on YouTube or writing a blog or tweeting or putting something on Facebook. Professional journalism is something that is professional, with values, with the need for training, with standards to be maintained in terms of accuracy and in terms of principles. And they're being tested at present. And with technology, and what we're trying to do is help people on that first step to not disregard journalism. And if they go through the school of experience that we're going to give them, they'll end up on the kind of training courses that you're talking about.
You talk very much about going back to basics almost in terms of training, beliefs, getting your core message, talking about vision for the future. Would that get with all the Twitter noise today? And I was just wondering your view around that.
There's a difference between heat and light and noise and a Bach concerto or a sort of, in my case, a jazz song. I still think the more that is out there, ultimately the more people appreciate somebody who curates, who edits, who sifts through all the nonsense and finds for them what is of interest. And I think that's the core offering of newspapers these days is not, anyone here can just set their computer so that every day they only get stories about Cardiff City Football Club and what's happening in the NHS in Maragam or whatever, if you want. But I think there will always be a market for people saying, I like the Times because it's X, or I like the Guardian because it's X, and you take the package, and you expect somebody to challenge you every day by putting things in front of you that you wouldn't seek yourself. And just because we can all book our holidays doesn't mean that we don't occasionally want a travel agent to do it for us. So I think there is a future for journalism like that. It's harder because when people have the option of some news for free, it's harder to make them pay good money to fund the journalism that is authoritative and well-informed and wittier and sharper and has some sort of kite mark on it. But that's the battle that we as a company in particular have gone for. We've put all our products behind a paywall and said, you want this kind of journalism, it costs. You wouldn't open a restaurant and give the food away for free. If you do that, you end up with nonsense. You end up with a newsroom like the Huffington Post with 10 people in it. If you want proper journalism where you've got a correspondent on the ground in Syria and you've got a columnist who's been around the block for 40 years and knows what he or she is talking about, and you have humour and you have Sudoku, or you have page 3, won't get into that debate, then it costs and it's paid for, and I think there is a future for that, but it's a future that's quite hard to fight for at the moment. Oh, sorry, Geraint, continue with him.
First of all, Guto, can I thank you for a very, very useful corrective to a very familiar whinge. And I think it's very important that these things are said, and I think you're absolutely spot on when it comes to sort of telling the Welsh story. If I can pick up on David Melding's point, I think that whereas Carwyn Jones has made quite a lot made a lot of waves on the sort of constitutional front, you know, I'm really surprised that he has not sought to make any waves on the economic front in terms of the rebalancing of the UK. That would seem to me to be another track in the agenda that he might have pursued. It hasn't. But you know, so I think that corrective is extremely useful. I do, however, want to pick you up on one thing. And it's on your strictures about the what's proposed in terms of royal charters and the regulation of the press. I declare an interest as a trustee of the Media Standards Trust and a backer of the charter. Your description of what would happen under these circumstances, I think, does not pass the test of accuracy or fairness. There is nothing in the recognition body that will prevent publication of anything in advance, and it is there to ensure that a system of self-regulation set up by the press would actually operate in an honest and an independent way. Because the record of the press over the last 50 years in this has been dreadful. We've had commission after commission after commission, last chance saloon, time and again, and nothing has happened. And even through the depth of the phone hacking scandal and so on, the press was still saying that the press commission was okay. So the level of trust in the press to actually operate this is at rock bottom. And I think the recognition panel, to be honest, will impose no kind of censorship on the press, but will actually do something to improve public trust in the press. And that certainly needs to be sorted out.
A lot of this, I think, is based on a misperception of the PCC, Press Complaints Commission, being there to stop phone hacking. Phone hacking is a criminal offence, as I'm acutely aware at the moment from daily calls involving lengthy proceedings in the Old Bailey. There is a remedy for phone hacking. It's called the law. We don't need a new regulator to prevent phone hacking. It's illegal. So is paying public officials. There'll be another court case on that. So it's posing, and from my point of view, deliberately conflating two things that are unrelated. So the press regulator is never there to sort of uphold the law. The police are meant to do that, and the prosecuting authorities. It is meant to be there to encourage responsible behaviour by the press within what is already quite a tight legal framework. The libel laws in the UK, in England and Wales, are tighter than in most comparable countries. When I talk now, on your point about the recognition body, to American journalists and American lawyers, the idea that you can actually have the Privy Council, sounds grand, but it was 9 ministers, 9 members of the government, sitting in secret, not publishing a criteria, not taking any evidence, deciding to pass a charter, put it in front of the Queen, I won't get into that one, and her sort of signing that, to create a body that can then tell the self-regulating press body, this is not good enough. You have to change that. You have to do it differently. If politicians can create the law, they can change the law. And it introduces for the first time into the dynamics of our fragile and subtle and carefully balanced organic constitution the concept that politicians, via votes in Parliament and via the Privy Council, which is essentially politicians behind closed doors, have a say over what is publishable and what isn't. And even though it's a point of principle at the moment, it's not hard to imagine in a context that we've had very recently that being used to sort of say, your regulation ain't good enough, you need to tighten it. Who are you? At that point, they say, we are a body charged with recognising you or not recognising you, set up by Royal Charter with politicians lying in the background. Doesn't feel right. It's not right. Beg to differ. One in the back.
Thanks. If I could just return back to coverage of the Assembly briefly, and perhaps one aspect that's not been picked up tonight. Perhaps it's not necessarily the problem of the World at One editor not taking a Welsh news story or wanting to cover a Welsh news story, but more the fact that when he leads with, for example, Michael Gove's education reforms, there's often very little mention, or often no mention at all, that those reforms aren't going to apply to their Welsh listeners. I mean, I know there's difficulties in the flow of news and in sort of reporting that, but it is a problem.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair point. But I do think the BBC in particular is quite striking these days, and I'd say the same for the Times, in pointing out these do not apply in Wales. So they may not cover what the situation is in Wales, but they at least point out that Michael Gove's so-called reforms only apply in England. And to which I'd say, as long as they do that, fine. The challenge then is to sort of ring up the producers and say, now, if you're interested in education reform, let me tell you about something really dramatic and interesting and worthwhile that we're doing in Wales that you don't know about. And I never know, you know, when I got dragged into a debate about why Wales hadn't had any Olympic venues, I posed the question, did anyone ask for an Olympic venue? Did anyone go up and, you know, lobby LOCOG for the mountain biking to be near Bridgend or the sailing to be on the Llŷn Peninsula? And nobody put their hand up. It was just, there's some sort of expectation that somebody sitting somewhere that we've never met or never heard of will sit there, and of all the great ideas that come into the head out of nowhere, intuitively, they will say, hey, why don't we do a piece on education reform in Wales? Somebody needs to get hold of them and tell them. Somebody needs to flag it up. Somebody needs to go and lobby for Olympic venues for Wales. There won't be an Olympics in London for a long time now, but missed opportunity. But I'm not aware that anybody tried to get it. And yet the chorus of Wales being neglected was as loud as ever afterwards. It's still the passive politics that has, you know, frustrated some of us enormously. And, you know, some of us had hoped it would have changed a bit more under devolution.
Do you think, therefore, Guto, and I'm from several points that have been made tonight, and they've been most interesting ones, and I have enjoyed it very much. Do you think perhaps we ought to send our Assembly members to a charm school?
I can't speak about the Assembly members. I will say that a good friend, who's a very well-known TV presenter, who got a show in Wales recently, was shocked how hard it was to get Assembly members to go on his show on a Sunday in Wales. I don't think he would mind me saying, but he was horrified. Whereas, you know, there are politicians fighting to get on the Andrew Marr show, to get on the Daily Politics, to get on all the programs that, you know, discuss politics, whether it's the weekend or late at night or early in the morning or whatever. And I think it is fair, you know, and he wouldn't mind me saying, but he was quite horrified how hard it was to get Assembly members to come in on a Sunday morning to do stuff on a big flagship program like the one that, you know, he was brought in to present. Now that's, you know, maybe shouldn't exaggerate the effect of that, but it suggests that maybe the energy and determination isn't quite as, you know, ruthless and mad as it is elsewhere. But politicians are meant to be slightly demented, aren't they?
Well, you work for Boris Johnson, so you must live with that.
I'll leave that one. Any more? My former tutor taught me everything I know about journalism.
I think it's a very admirable thing to be doing, to set up and encouraging young people to come into journalism. But you still have a problem that there aren't so many jobs in journalism. They are reducing, particularly in newspapers. And starting salaries are very low. And what would you plan, if there is anything that can be planned, to turn that around?
I don't believe in the state creating jobs as such. Don't think you're suggesting that. I think as a company, by charging for our product, we're able to invest in our product. By investing in our product, we're able to grow. The Sun on Sundays recently spent £1 million hiring journalists when the Mirror were laying journalists off. A very poignant thing was that Tony Parsons, who's written for the Mirror for 18 years, left the Mirror. They could hardly afford to keep paying him, and he joined the Sun. So we're hiring columnists, we're hiring people, we're hiring a lot of young, talented young people who can do things digitally that old codgers like me couldn't sort of do, or certainly not do as well. So there are jobs, and there will be jobs if companies invest. And I think one of the disasters, one of the greatest miscalculations of the last 25 years in journalism was somehow, at some particular point in time, the industry collectively took the Harry Carey decision of deciding to give away its content. Stuff that you spend good money on producing, we started giving it away with no sense of what the consequences of that would be over time. And that's why the jobs are fewer and further between. So we would like to encourage people to go into journalism in the hope that we as a company will A, stick around for 30 years, and B, grow over 30 years. Nobody's sort of standing still here. We're sort of bringing in new products, new apps. We're discussing some things today, opening new offices all the time. Now, that's not going to create all the jobs for everyone we can produce, but I'd also say that a background in journalism and a period in journalism is great training and a great skill to do a whole load of other things as well. So even if you only do journalism for a few years, it's great training to be all kinds of things, including Mayor of London. Gary.
What is the relative value to the company of a subscriber to the paper and a subscriber to the digital site?
I think it's top secret, market sensitive information, but essentially I think it's fair to say that the Times, in order to create a new business model, offered its digital product far too cheaply for many years. So we drove people who were paying good money to read the print edition, clever as they are, to think, why pay all that money to read in print? I don't mind reading it on my new tablet. At which point we got a lot less money out of them. And even though it costs less to give news to people electronically than to print it on paper and drive it in vans across the UK, you understand more about the newspaper production than I do. But in the end, that was a bit of a mistake. It needed to be done in order to build up the subscription. So what we're trying to do now is to make sure that we halt the hemorrhaging in the print buying of the papers by stopping the opportunity of people going to access the same content essentially for free elsewhere. So already there's some tiny indication that print circulation of the Sun has stopped falling as steeply since people had to pay for it online. Because if they're going to pay for it anyway, they think, well, then I might as well pay for it to buy the paper, because I actually quite like the paper. So hopefully it'll even out, and the relative worth will be fairly similar. Diolch yn fawr.
Guto, thanks very much for a wide-ranging discussion. I think it's rather different that we spent twice as long on the question and answers as we did actually on the lecture, but thank you very much for that. I thought you were being mischievous when you started batting back the question and saying the reason Wales gets no coverage is because you've got nothing of interest, you don't package it, and actually your politicians can't be asked to get out of bed on a Sunday. But having said that, what I think we may have ducked here tonight is that you've given us 3 good news stories about the Academy, about the possibility of a Sun office, and what was the third one? On press regulation. And we've just got the BBC. We've got the BBC here, and Media Wales may do it through a press release. So we haven't actually got those outlets, and I think that's what your dad was talking about. We haven't got the outlets to let people know of what is actually happening, be that a News UK press release or not. Ond diolch o galon I chi am...
But thank you very much for the lecture.
...appreciation to Guto in the traditional way.
The National Assembly for Wales is the democratically elected body that represents the interests of Wales and its people, makes laws for Wales, and holds the Welsh Government to account. For more information and to find out who represents you, go to assemblywales.org or follow us on Facebook and Twitter.